Guys, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg, here today to talk to you about two books that I recently finished. The first is one that I talked about in my April roundup briefly. I kind of went into the mechanics of how I read it, but I didn't actually talk about the book very much, so I wanted to expand a little bit. It's Conversations with Friends by Hallie Rooney. I had never read Hallie Rooney, but I was really curious because so many people on BookTube have been talking about her, especially since Normal People came out last year. It just came out in the US last month. So I felt like I had to try reading one of her books. So I did, and I really liked the process of reading the book. The book to me was kind of fine. I liked it. I didn't love it. I always felt a little bit dispassionate about it. So it's about Frances, who is a university student in Ireland, and she has this friend named Bobby. Bobby and Frances used to be girlfriends, but now they are just best friends. Bobby broke it off with Frances, and they continue to really be part of each other's lives, and they're not, I wouldn't say inseparable, but they perform together. Frances writes poetry, and Bobby does her performs it with her in front of audiences. And although Frances is the one who's doing most of the creative work, Bobby is kind of the one who sells it, and that's kind of how they relate to the world. Frances is much more internal and quiet, and Bobby is this kind of force of nature personality who, even though she can be very pointed and kind of in your face, people tend to love her. And Frances really feels unloved. In the beginning of the book, they meet a photographer named Melissa, and they become entwined in Melissa's life a little bit. Bobby has a crush on Melissa, even though Melissa is married to a kind of, I don't want to say middling actor. He's not famous, but he is successful. His name is Nick. So Frances and Bobby kind of get pulled into the world of Melissa and Nick and form a romantic quadrangle where Bobby is kind of flirting with Melissa. Melissa's kind of flirting back. And Frances, who is bisexual, starts flirting with Nick. They get drawn into a relationship and start having an affair on the side, and it's about all of the complications that come from that. Like I said, I liked the book. I always felt it a bit of a remove from it. The plot I thought was predictable, if I'm being honest. I kind of knew exactly where it was going from the beginning, but the selling point of the book is how deeply Hallie Rooney goes into the head of Frances as Frances tells her story. It's kind of like a psychological profile, and that is where I get to what I really found fascinating about this book, which was the process of reading it. Because Hallie Rooney is a very clever writer. She's doing so much on every page that you almost wouldn't notice if you don't stop and think about it. I don't take notes every time I read a book anymore, but I was compelled to do it with this one. And one of the things I did, in addition to noting down lines that I particularly liked, I started noticing very early on that there's this idea of performance. Not just because Frances writes these poems that they then perform, but the idea of performing seems to come up a lot in Frances's mind. There's a line early on where she worries about what expression her face is portraying to someone, and that continues throughout the book. So I started noting down every time someone is concerned about performance or pretending something, and it's really interesting because it happens so much in the beginning, and then it goes away at a certain point for about 30 to 40 pages, and then it starts coming back. All of a sudden, Frances is locked in her head, worried about performing for the world and what the world is going to think of her. So it's interesting what's going on in the story when she's worried about it in the beginning, when it goes away, and then when it comes back. And as the book progresses, other people start getting in on this idea of performing for somebody or putting on a show. So that they don't seem genuine. And genuine was another thing I started noting, but even though it's hard to tell in this book when somebody is being genuine, even when it feels like they're being open and raw and letting somebody in, are they really being honest? The idea of being a normal person or normal people, which to me seemed particularly resonant because I know Hallie Rooney's follow-up book was named Normal People. That was something that came up a lot, the idea of acclaim and fame and power. Love with a question mark, because you don't really know if anything that's going on in this book is love. it's just that part was really fascinating, and I couldn't stop paying attention to the mechanics of what Sally Rooney was doing. And while I really appreciate everything she did, and I think everything that she was doing is really clever because it reveals so much, not just about Frances, but about all of the characters. I wish I liked the book as much as I liked the process of having this total nerd out experience of reading it. If you have the stamina to do something like this, like a deep dive into the actual writing and tracking what Sally Rooney's doing, I recommend it. It pays off. But, you know, I fully understand if you're not super interested in doing such a close read of this book. But to me, that was the main appeal of Conversations with Friends. So, there's that. I have just started Normal People, Sally Rooney's next book, and right off the bat, I'm only about 5 pages in, but it seems like she's already playing with the idea of perception. So we seem to have gotten a little bit away from Frances's internal view, where she's worried about pretending to be something for other people, and in this book, it seems to be that more of an external thing, where you're worried about how others will perceive you. It's not what you're projecting to them; it's how they're going to see you. It'll be interesting to see if that's actually the case, or if that's just something that happens within 5 pages. We'll see. The other book I finished was The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. I had seen this book on Savage Reads. Simon was talking about it, and it just sounded really interesting to me because the idea of it is that Jack the Ripper is obviously a very famous person, even though we don't know who he is. But not much, if anything, is known about his 5 victims. And Hallie Rubenhold goes about correcting that. She wants you to know their lives, and she wants to give them their stories back, because basically what's happened is since everybody knows Jack the Ripper but not them, they are only ever seen through the lens of Jack the Ripper. You don't actually see them at all. You only see him. Their stories are defined by this thing that was done to them. So Hallie Rubenhold is giving them their story back. I love that idea. That's something I'm very fascinated with. I feel like a lot of women in history have had their stories taken away and are defined by things that men do to them. So I love the idea of this book, and the execution is really good as well. These women had fascinating lives, and it's really interesting too because you really get to do a deep dive into the process of being a historian and piecing together these things, because these were lower class women. Basically, the only way to piece together their lives is to find documents about them, like census records, so you can find out where they were living, if the documentation to find out when they got married, documentation to find out how many times they checked into workhouses, because they ended up, of course, all 5 of them ended up going in and out of workhouses and without lodging at certain points. It's fascinating to figure out how the process of history works in that sense, and being a historian. It's interesting as well because this creates a really deep and profound portrait of life in Victorian England. Usually when you do read about these older eras, such as the Victorian, the perspective is pretty much upper class, and it's really interesting to actually see how the other half lived, so to speak, and the lives that these women led. And you know, coincidentally, these women actually lived very varied lives that portray all different sides of the story. The first one, Polly Nichols is married and then moves into kind of like an early concept version of the projects for lower housing that is affordable for lower income families, but they have to apply for it, they have to qualify for it, and they have to continue to qualify for it in order to stay there. Her marriage falls apart, and because her marriage falls apart, she ends up living on the streets. Nothing happens to her husband, but she ends up living on the streets and going about and being a vagrant. And it gets into the idea of, because and most of these women at one point or another end up living on the street, they are correlated with prostitution. But there's only actually evidence that one of them was a prostitute and one of them had been a prostitute in the past. The other 2 basically were living on the street, but at the time, if you were living on the street, it was just assumed that you were a prostitute. So that's one story. Another woman is a military wife, who struggles with alcoholism. Another one is an immigrant. She comes from Sweden and settles in the United States, not the United States, in England, to start her life over. And there's the story of like syphilis. And Mary Kelly, the final one, actually, nothing is really known about her early life at all. But she was living as a high-end prostitute who ended up living in the poor neighborhood. It's just, these stories are really interesting, and because they're so varied, it really gives you a portrait of everything that was going on in Victorian England at the time. I just found it really fascinating, and like, I love the idea of giving these women their stories back. As such, Hallie Rubenhold kind of ignores a lot of the Ripper mythology. If you want a book about Jack the Ripper, this is not it. She doesn't go into the police investigation so much, only in so much as the police investigation reveals details about these lives, because so much of what is known about them comes from the inquests and the newspaper reporting after it, and the struggle to sift through all of that to find accurate information. She doesn't get into, usually, I've read one Jack the Ripper book in the past which had these horrible, lurid photos of the bodies of these women and detailed graphic descriptions of the crime scenes. That is not here. That is not at all what Hallie Rubenhold is doing. She does not want to treat these women like victims, like traditional Ripper books would do. She wants to show you about their lives and to teach you something about who they were or who they might have been. And I just found that really fascinating. So I definitely recommend that. And I recommend Conversations with Friends, especially if you want to do a kind of deep dive like I did. If you have read either of these books, let me know. If you have any opinions about Sally Rooney, I would love to hear it. If you've read any of Hallie Rubenhold's other books, I know she has a couple of them, let me know where I should go next, because I would love to read some more of her. And let me know what you're reading right now, and what you've been reading. And as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate it. If you have already subscribed, thank you for that. If not, I hope you enjoyed this enough that you will subscribe or come back, and I'll be back again. Until then, happy reading, everybody.